Hey, welcome back, everybody. Craig Peterson here on WGAN. Thanks for joining us today. Hopefully you're picking up a lot of good information. We're just talking about the CDC, some of the scams that are out there right now from the coronavirus, including one involving Bitcoin, which actually kind of surprised me. We talked a lot in the first hour about the major scams on Airbnb. That's one of those sites you go to online and rent an apartment for a day or a week or a month, rent property almost anywhere. It's really quite neat. But the major scams that have been going on there and how I've seen them personally and why I will never use it ever again. If you want to listen to that, just go to craigpeterson.com/tunein. You can subscribe right there. Listen to me live, by the way, on TuneIn when I'm on the radio here and when I'm on with Ken and Matt. The morning drive every Wednesday at 7:37 every Wednesday morning as well. And those are all on TuneIn. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about this whole thing with the ACLU and their fight right now. I spoke about something similar to this a couple of years ago. Man, maybe actually first time was probably about 10 years ago. There are companies out there that gather information about us. They're called data brokers. And I have visited some of these data brokers' sites themselves. I mean physical sites where the company operates, where they have their data collections to help them with security problems that they have and to help prevent problems from occurring, right? That's what I do for a living full time. And it was probably 10 years ago on my radio show that I talked with some of these companies. But what they do is they take what's called open source information. That's used a lot by government for investigations. And you can use open source information yourself. All you do is you go to Google, for instance, and do a search. That's open source information. It's anything that anyone can gain access to without having to be a police officer, without having to go and really kind of, get a court order, kind of be surreptitious in how you gather. That's open source. So the data brokers will take all of that, and that can include, depending on the state you live in, driver's license information. It can include information about the mortgage for your home. It can include, the ownership of your home. It can include just all kinds of stuff. And that becomes very, very difficult to control because all of your information is out there. It's available for free or for cheap on the internet. So these data brokers, they might buy it from the county. They might get it in open source. Some of these documents are going to contain, like your mortgage is going to contain your signature. The deed to your home is going to contain the signature. The automobiles that you own, there's going to be UCC filings with the Secretary of State's office detailing what cars you own, who the lien holders are, and how much money is involved. All of this stuff. So it all gets pulled into these databases. I mentioned on the show a couple of months ago, that we were out in Las Vegas at a wedding. And of course, doing work while I'm out there. And I'm sitting there on the couch doing work for some of our Las Vegas clients. And there's a knock at the door. And who's there? Well, it's an insurance investigator investigating an accident that it was a fatal accident. And of course, the insurance company had been asked to pay out. So they came to this home because they had information that the person involved had a contact with someone at this address, which indeed she did. It was her sister. And apparently the driver had been responsible for this fatal death. And the driver had been listed as one of my sisters-in-law, who had died a couple of months before the accident. So obviously it was all faked. But the insurance investigator showed my wife all of this information she had that they had purchased from one of these data brokers. And it had listed my deceased sister-in-law's relatives, everybody, every address she had ever had. It had names and contact information for some of my kids as well. Now, it wasn't all organized correctly, and when I've looked at the data broker's information about me, about half of it's correct, but the other half is completely incorrect, and that's still the case because they had a lot of completely incorrect information. People that they said were relatives that weren't, people we'd never heard of before. In fact, they said were direct relatives of hers. But at any rate, what had happened is they had purchased all of this information from a data broker. And in collections, it's called a skip trace. It's called a skip trace for people who jump bail, etc. Man, we should actually talk about this whole bail thing and the idiocy in New York State that is spreading countrywide. Dog the Bounty Hunter and his wife Beth had been fighting this for a long time because it's really making us much, much less safe. But anyhow, that's not a topic for today's show. It's really not a political topic because it's very obvious what's already happening with the increase in the crime rate in New York. Anyways, what the government is doing now, and this is part of what I was warning about a decade ago, is the federal government, the FBI, the NSA, the CIA, the IRS, you name it, they are limited in how they can collect information. You kind of already knew that, right? You knew that they had to get a search warrant for certain things, right? They can follow you around if you have no expectation of privacy, et cetera, et cetera. So obviously, federal government agencies can use open source information in order to see what you're doing online. But how about the closed source stuff? How about the stuff that the data brokers are collecting? Some of it they're getting from the people who lent you money. Some of it they're getting from places where you have to pay to get that information. So what's happened here now is that the ACLU has filed a suit, according to the Wall Street Journal, against Homeland Security. And apparently Homeland Security, through its Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, as well as Customs and Border Protection, is buying geolocation data from these data brokers, and it's using it to investigate suspects who have allegedly committed immigration violations. So let me boil all that down into plain English. You might be using games on your smartphone. You might be using all kinds of apps on your smartphone. In fact, if you have a smartphone, you probably are. And frankly, you're probably not using 95% of those apps that you have downloaded. But many of those apps are tracking you. And that information is being sold to data brokers. So think about that for a minute. Remember that free app and how you've heard me and many others for so many years say, hey, you're not the customer, you are the product? Well, what's happening here now is that the ACLU is saying to the federal government, hey, you cannot buy this information that you're barred from collecting yourself. You cannot buy it from data brokers or these app developers who are selling it. Interesting question, interesting problem, isn't it? What should they do? What should you do? What can you do? This is going to play out in court. I suspect it's going to come down on the side of the Department of Homeland Security because this information is generally available to anyone who's willing to pay for it. So now the government stepped forward saying, we'll pay for it. And by the way, it's all the way down to local law enforcement as well, who in many cases are also buying this information from the data brokers. So let's stick around. When we come back, we're going to talk about shadow IT. If you don't know what it is, it's a problem if you're in business.